devices. We'll be taking public testimony at the end of this hearing and would appreciate it if you'd sign in and indicate if you'd like to testify. We ask folks to state their name and affiliation for the record and just limit your comments to a few minutes to ensure that all comments and concerns can be heard. If you're watching at home, you can also submit written testimony by mail or by email at ccc.wm@boston.gov. So today's hearing is on Docket 0268, an order for a hearing regarding the fiscal year 2020 Boston Public Schools transportation budget. And before we begin, I'm just going to read into the record 2 letters from 2 of our colleagues who could not join us. Councillor Ed Flynn of District 2 has written to say, please note that I'm not able to attend today's hearing on Docket 0268 due to my attendance at a conference on disability rights. I want to thank Councillor Asabi George for sponsoring this hearing and thank the panelists and attendees for being here. It is critical that BPS provides safe and equitable transportation to all students, especially students with disabilities. I look forward to reviewing the tapes of this hearing and continue to work with my colleagues in BPS on this issue. So that's from Councillor Ed Flynn. And from Councillor Andrea Campbell, the District City Councillor for District 4. She writes, Dear Chairwoman Bach and colleagues of the Committee on Ways and Means, I regretfully cannot attend today's hearing on Docket 0268. I commend Councillor Asabi George for continuing to host hearings on this important issue. With the declining student population and skyrocketing BPS transportation costs, which often exceed the BPS budget allocation, it is imperative that we explore creative ways to immediately cap and eventually reduce these transportation costs with the goal of redirecting these funds to our schools. We pay an exorbitant amount for transportation that often does not deliver a high-quality service to our families, as, for example, evidenced by the consistent complaints regarding transportation my office receives from families, especially on the first day of school. I believe that exploring cost-saving measures and improving quality serves our families' interests and fulfills our responsibility as fiscal stewards for the City of Boston. I will be ably represented by a member of my staff at today's hearing and look forward to reviewing today's hearing recording and committee report and working with the committee on any recommended next steps. So again, that's Councillor Andrea Campbell from District 4. Both those colleagues regret not being able to be here today. We now move to our invited guests. First, Ed Pesch from the Assistant Director of Transportation for the Boston Public Schools, Sam DePina, the Interim Operations Director for BPS, and we're also joined by Charlene Breiner. So, which of you would like to?
Sure, I'd like to start, but pretty much went through introductions, so thank you very much. Good afternoon, council members, Councilwoman Peck, Madam President, Sabi George, Mr. Arroyo. We want to just start a little bit with introductions. So.
Good afternoon, Ed Pesch, Assistant Director of Finance for Department of Transportation at Boston Public Schools.
I'm Charlene Breiner. I'm serving as the Interim Chief of Staff for Superintendent Caselius at Boston Public Schools, and I feel privileged to be in Boston for this period of time.
And I just want to also acknowledge Delvern Stanislaus, who's unable to be here with us because she's sick. She's our Transportation Director, so we wish her well as she's recovering home where she's supposed to be while the team pitches in and helps out. So thank you. Thank you again for giving us the opportunity to speak to you regarding our budget. It's our commitment to provide quality service to all students in Boston. And this commitment starts with Dr. Caselius, and she's hired an external consultant to meet with us and work with us to review all of our operations in our departments. And he'll be coming up with some recommendations shortly on those findings. And we look forward to those and work with him to implement those. Currently, the BPS budget for transportation is about $125 million. And in a moment, you'll hear from Mr. Pesch around some critical cost drivers of that budget, which includes all the typical volumes and services that we provide, our non-Boston public school obligations, and around information on our school choice options that drive the cost of the budget. Finally, we'll provide a spending breakdown of that budget. You'll see a detailed budget breakdown of the different components that include our contract with TransDev, our special education transportation, and other factors that influence the spending. So thanks again for the opportunity, and I'll turn it over to Mr. Pesch.
continue for me. Right, green. All right. I'll still get started in the meantime. Today, we're going to start by reviewing the services that the department provides, the types of students and the types of schools that we transport to. And then from there, we're going to speak a bit more specifically about what we spend our money on. So on slide 3, we're going to start by reviewing exactly what the department is required and committed to providing at the highest level possible. On a daily basis, we transport over 24,000 students to 235 unique sites, and those are inside and out of Boston proper. We do this on 3,104 trips, which are performed by our buses every day. Our buses, in total, do 43,000 miles each day. We transport 5,621 students to 115 non-BPS sites. That's 22% of the students that we transport and 48% of the sites that we transport to.
If you don't mind.
In Boston and out, schools draw from all over the city, causing 362 of the 3,000 trips to have 4 or fewer students on them. There are a bunch of reasons why this happens, but a lot of it comes down to school choice. 120 of the 235 schools that we draw students from at least 10 different zip codes, with 67 schools drawing students from more than 15 zip codes. Over 5,500 students are receiving door-to-door transportation per their IEP, their individualized educational plan. And that represents nearly half of all the stops that our buses are making every day. Also, the number of students who require one-to-one monitors has grown by 193% since FY15. There are also a number of other factors that contribute to the large service and also the large amount of spending that the department does. Over 624 homeless and foster care students are transported in and out of Boston, and this year we're at a projected cost of $7.1 million. And another thing that's unique about the transportation budget is that it bears the burden that many non-transportation related expenses. Okay. What we have here is a comparison from FY15 to the current year, FY20. And what we're trying to show here is that while we have seen a decline in the number of students that we're transporting, the number of places that we're driving to has grown. And one quick thing to point out about FY15, which is causing the large decrease, is between FY15 to FY16 was when BPS and the city made the transition for 7th and 8th graders to go from yellow school buses to the MBTA, unless it's required per their IEP. But the important take here is the number of sites. When we're transporting to more sites, it means that the students are distributed amongst many more buses. At the time when we pulled this data, there were 32 schools that we were only transporting one student to. And then there were another 44 schools that had only between 2 and 5 students. So as you can imagine, we might want to be linking up different schools, but different start times and different locations throughout the city don't provide us an avenue for that.
Could you just say that one more time?
Yeah, you want the
So
couple little
32 and
statistics?
then-
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So there are 32 schools that we transport to that only have one student going to them. So they may have other students, that are in walking distance or, because it's 7th, 8th grade, or, 7th and up that they're taking the T. But there's only one student that we're required to transport via the bus, so they're on the bus alone. And then there are another 44 schools on top of the 32 that have only 2 to 5 students.
Thank you.
While we are the Boston Public Schools Department of Transportation, we are still mandated and committed to transporting students to non-BPS schools. On this table on this slide, we're showing how many non-Boston public school students we serve and the total cost for each type of student. As you can see, there is disparity between the costs of the different types of students, meaning corner, door-to-door, or those who are receiving an M7 to take the MBTA. But more importantly, note is the total amount of spending that is devoted towards non-BPS schools. It comes out to over $26 million, and these are FY19 figures, but we wanted to give you a flavor of the cost here. And at $26 million, that's about 1 in every $5 spent is resources going to deliver students to non-Boston Public Schools sites. Okay. Now we're just going to give a quick refresher on the BPS transportation budget that started July 1st. And we're going to take a couple little deeper dives into specific line items that we've seen major cost growth and are applying major pressures on the budget. So this slide here provides the current year budget and about 4 years of historical spending, just to give you context of what we've been looking at the last few years. And as you can see at the bottom of the table, that shows each year-over-year growth that we've seen. So while we have been spending more money each and every year, we've been able to bend the cost curve down and decrease the rate of growth. And that's all with keeping the same level of service over those years. And this is kind of the first deeper dive in what we're actually spending our money on. And I'm going to take you, I guess, left to right is the easiest way to go through this. But to provide some context, because of the level of service that we're required to provide from everything I've been speaking about, it takes a pretty large operation. In total, it's about 1,600 employees, and that's, if we siloed that from BPS, that would be the 4th largest workforce behind teachers, police, and I think pretty close behind firefighters. So it is a large operation, and that's really what's driving cost here. So the transportation system, to give some extra is made up of a contract with Transdev, who's the transportation provider. So 70% of the costs flow through this contract, and they're an international transit firm that works from everything from ride shares at airports, and the Super Shuttle was theirs, to also Keolis-like services that the MBTA outsources in other districts. So they have a wide breadth of the transit industry, and we're one of their largest school or pupil transportation contracts. So like I mentioned, 70% of all costs flow through that, and that's comprised of things like our drivers, our maintenance staff, our dispatchers, as well as the cost to provide parts and fuel, and also maintain our 3 bus yards and the facilities and snow plowing, and everything that it takes to actually operationalize this system. And that, if you look all the way on the left, that's in blue, the bottom left. Then there are a set of things that BPS spends money directly on, and that's things like the central office staff assigned to the transportation department, purchasing the buses, employing the bus monitors, buying the M7 passes from the MBTA for the students. And I kind of want to show on the right-hand side, over the last couple of years, while Transdev's costs are clearly the majority of the costs, it's actually the things in red, the BPS direct spending, what's been growing at a faster rate, at around, I think it's about 5% compared to 3.5%. And that's been mainly driven by things like our bus monitor personnel costs, and transporting our students in transition, the homeless and students in custody of the state. Before diving into the direct PPS spending, I figured it'd be good to dive into the TransDev-related spending because it is such a large portion of our spending. So on the left-hand side, this is all things that we spend on TransDev and everything, all costs that are passed through. A majority, almost 80% of this spending is on personnel. So as I mentioned earlier, that's drivers, mechanics, some administrative staff, our safety department, who drive around servicing stops when our drivers may have issues making it down a road or having other issues out in the field. And they're employing directly around 1,000 employees. Obviously, a large majority of this is the actual wage or the salary that they're making, but there are other personnel costs. And this is actually a unique part of the BPS transportation budget. There's no other city budget besides BPS as a whole and the Health Commission that bears the burden of the health insurance costs directly within our budget. And the other cost there are other fringe costs. So because all these employees are employed by a private company and not a public agency, they don't feed into the state pension system. So it's also a heavily unionized workforce, so a lot of the collective bargaining agreements have 401k company matches, so we bear the burden of the match. And the last thing I'd like to note about personnel costs like this, they're almost always going to rise year in, year out. All of the contracts at TransDev, I believe, all have 2% cost of living adjustments. And then also, like I mentioned, we're at the mercy of the health insurance market for the premiums that are negotiated with, the different health insurance providers that TransDev contracts with. And on top of that, the match that I previously mentioned per the CBA's increase every year. Now to transition back towards the BPS-related spending, and this is the largest part of the budget outside of our contract and our TransDev. So it's not your typical yellow bus service itself, but still a required service nonetheless. In this table, you'll see stacked columns, and those represent the number of students in the system who require monitors. The blue on the bottom are the number of students who require a general monitor, and the red on top are the number of students who require one-to-one. And just for those who don't know, if Sam and I both required general monitors on a bus, the department would be able to staff that bus with one adult, one bus monitor. But if Sam and I both required to have one-to-one monitors, then we would have to provide two adults on the bus to supervise the children. So as you can imagine, having students who require one-to-one monitors are pretty costly, and about 5 times the amount. Okay. Yeah. Interesting. Okay. So up here, I guess the printouts may be a little messed up, but the projection looks all right.
We'll get you the correct slide. Okay?
Yeah, absolutely. Apologize for that. The green line shows the cost. So as you can see, there's a pretty distinct correlation with the number of students that were required to provide monitors for and the cost of providing it. And this is, while we have fine-tuned how we do our projections on understanding next year costs, this is an area where we're running a deficit in terms of a specific line item.
How much of a deficit?
So currently the projection is 10.6, and the FY20 budget was set at 8.9 million. So 10.6 million is what we're currently projecting on spending, and we set the budget at 8.9. And that was came from, because that's where the previous year spending was, so we thought it'd be in line, but we've been working hard and hiring and doing a lot more training of our monitors to make sure that every single bus is staffed with the required personnel and making sure that they're providing the best possible service for those students. And we actually just got, because we had school vacation week last week, we were able to do trainings for 200 monitors. On this slide, we're showing the cost to provide transportation services to homeless students and students in custody of the state. This is a major cost driver that, as you can see from the chart on the left, has been growing pretty rapidly over the last couple of years. Our estimates for these students is at about $24,000 per student on an annualized basis. The reason this is so expensive is that these students in the service we provide is so temporary, because we have students hopping from homeless shelter or from foster care to a different foster home. So because of that, it does kind of push up the cost when you compare it to the students who were delivering to and from home to the same location day in and day out.
It's imperative that you provide that service to those students, so we want to be as flexible as possible.
Absolutely, yeah. And there are different mandates and laws that cover the different types of students. So homeless is covered under the McKinney-Vento Act, and then the custody of the state is under ESSA, so homeless students fall under ESSA, Every Student Succeeds Act. And these are an example of a group of students who were coming in and out of Boston. So we actually have students who may be residing in a homeless shelter or in a foster care system, home, or with a foster family that's outside of Boston, coming back to a Boston Public Schools. So in the DCF case, it's a decision that's made with the family and the welfare agency, so DCF. It's called the best determination of interest for the student. And in both McKinney-Vento and DCF kind of laws and guidelines and regulations, transportation cost is not ever a factor within the best determination. So it's all about what's best for the student from an educational standpoint. And then lastly, this kind of combines both the, this printed out right? Yes. This combines both the, the service we provide and the dollars here. If we're working from the bottom up here, everything in a shade of blue is BPS, and then the green are charter, and then you can barely see the purple on the left-hand side because it represents a very, very small amount of students who we're transporting to private special education facilities in and out of Boston. While it is a small number of students, it does make up quite a bit of amount of money at almost 5%. Well, what's a really interesting takeaway here is in the BPS system is 30% of our students are corner to corner. They're corner stop students, and they represent 35% of costs. If you look up one rung from there, in a slightly lighter shade of blue, the 11% of students are our door-to-door students within BPS, and they also represent 35% of costs. So as you can imagine, there's a pretty drastic difference when you're looking at these costs on a per pupil basis. Yeah, that's what we had prepared today, so more than happy to answer any questions.
Great. So are you speaking, Sam? Or?
No, I was just...
Okay, great. I'm actually going to let the sponsor of the hearing order, Councilor George, start off with questions.
Great. Thank you, Chair Bach, and thank you all for being here today and giving, Ed especially for giving such a thoughtful and full presentation here. I've got a number of questions. I'll do a few of them now and then pass the mic and come back to them. I'm curious on the one, I think it was slide number 4, where we talked about the 32 schools that have 1 child per bus and the 44 schools that have 2 to 5 kids per bus. Can you talk a little bit more about where those kids, those students are attending schools, the types of schools? Because I know there's some challenges, not challenges, but there's some cost impacts when we talk about charter and parochial schools. And does this information inform some of the policy work that happens at the school department around where different programs are located across the district?
So I'd love to get you exact percentages, but when I pulled the list and was looking at it, for those, 76 schools, there were very, very few BPS schools. So most of them were the private special education facilities. So those are BPS students who are attending those private schools per, their IEP. And the other big chunk of those schools in terms of school type would have been exactly what you're saying, charter and private parochial. So obviously, the school committee and the policies that we can develop more so dictate the BPS schools. So we kind of have less control, I'd say.
So of the 32 schools or the 44 schools, it doesn't matter which group, how many of these non-BPS special ed schools in particular, if that's, we can talk about that group of schools, how many single rider buses are going to each of those schools? Because I imagine if it's the Carroll School, for example, and we talk sometimes about their special services around dyslexia in particular, do we have a number of buses riding to that school every single day with just one kid?
We would just have one bus transporting that one student.
Right, but how many so we may have a number of students that attend the Carroll School.
Correct. So they wouldn't have been included in here. These were just the schools that only have one student that we're transporting to.
Oh, I get you. Okay,
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
So like, for example, there might have been one charter school with one student on an IEP because it's a high school.
Right. Well,
So-
I do notice on your list that there's one private or parochial school
Yeah.
that
So
just
that's
has
actually
one student.
Perfect example. So we only provide transportation for that one student, and it might be a Catholic high school where we provide T-passes for the rest of the student. But because that one student has in his IEP that he requires door-to-door transportation, we have to we have to schedule a bus in our fleet to transport that one student.
And with that one student, he or she may also have a one-to-one monitor.
Correct.
And with the rise in number of monitors on our buses, the one-to-one in particular, do we see an opportunity, or is there an opportunity if a bus already has a bus monitor, that it's less likely that there might be some advocacy for a one-to-one monitor? Because we get calls through my office and through my work in education for us to support a family advocating for a one-to-one monitor. And we hear sometimes, and it's more anecdotal than anything else, but we hear sometimes because there are some safety concerns on that bus, if we were to have more bus monitors, general bus monitors, is there a correlation with fewer one-to-one monitors?
So fortunately, it's not quite that simple. Most families with students with disabilities have to have an individual education plan, IEP, and in those team meetings, the need for a bus monitor arises, and depending on the level of need of the student, one is assigned per the IEP.
Right.
So fortunately, those are not controlled by us, they're more by the team.
Oh, right. No, I appreciate that, but I would imagine, and I have a son on a 504 plan, not quite an IEP, but I participate in a yearly reevaluation. If there was already a general bus monitor on the bus, that there wouldn't perhaps be incidents that arise that would make a family feel that they need a one-on-one monitor.
In some cases, that may be acceptable to parents, but for the most part, a one-to-one monitor, it serves a specific purpose for that particular student, and their focus is just on that student, not necessarily the whole bus.
Yeah.
Whereas a monitor across the board would pay attention to the overall climate of the bus.
Yeah.
So it's
Right.
it's-
No, I appreciate that, and I recognize that there are certain students that require that one-on-one care. My feeling is that if we preemptively had more general bus monitors, that we would avoid the need for some of that one-on-one. And I think that it's because something happened, something something creates an incident, there's some sort of event, that a family says, my child perhaps needs a one-on-one monitor because there is either a safety concern or because of a child's special need, that it's helpful. But that's just my concern, and where they're so expensive.
Correct.
We recognize the need, especially for our younger kids, to have those monitors. I've gone on longer than I want in that question.
I do want to say
Yeah.
one quick thing, because I think it provides good context and answer, is the bus monitors that BPS Transportation employs and pays for are for students who require monitors within their IEP. If there are other issues, the district also provides what they're known as bus attendants. So it's not because of a student with an IEP, but because, exactly what you're saying, there might have been a fight on the bus or other. So we do that, and those are requested through the school, and again, usually more on a temporary basis because of a safety concern or something. So there are avenues and options for non-special education kind of requirements.
Great. And then my last question because I think it'll help some of the future questions that we all have here, is on slide 7, you talk about FY19 or growth from FY16 through current year FY20. The change is very low between FY19 and FY20. This is what we approved last year as a council. Where are we projected to be on spending for FY20?
Yes, that's the budget. So as of the last update that was done for school committee, the budget update, I think the district was projecting around a $5-ish million deficit overall. Again, being the beginning of the school year, the finance team is usually a little more conservative in their estimates. We made up, I believe, between $2 and $2.5 million of that. So
Part of why I have this hearing, and I've called for it every year since I took my council seat, is every year we're over by between $5 and $8 million in our transportation budget, and I think one year we hit 10. So that projected number for this year, we think will be 130.
Correct. So the $5 million was the district as a whole.
Okay.
So the entire $1 billion budget. So we were at the time of the.
I will just say I don't believe that.
Okay.
We're not going to be just $5 million in the whole BPS budget. We're usually about 5 or 6 or 7 million on the transportation budget alone.
Yeah, so I was just saying the whole BPS budget has been on budget every year for the last 30, 35 years. I know transportation has had some deficits that have been covered by other places in the budget. So at the time of the December update, we were projecting about a $2.5 million deficit. So 125.6 plus 2.5.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks so much. I just want to note also that we've been joined by Councilors OMalley and Breeden. Next I'll go to Councilor Arroyo. You all right? All right. Councilor OMalley.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the lead sponsor, Councilor Sabi-George, for once again calling this hearing. I look forward to this hearing, and it's particularly, I think, important to have this conversation before we get into the budget season, because we have been having this conversation every year. This marks my 10th year on the body, and we've been having this conversation. And one thing that's frustrating is that, as you correctly note on page 4, the number of students receiving transportation has decreased. It's decreased quite significantly from about 25,000 to 18,000. Now, there's a couple of reasons for that. Probably one large factor is the fact that in 2014, I believe, we phased out 7th and 8th grade yellow school transportation. But a larger issue, and an issue that's going to be really driving a lot of my work as it relates to the BPS budget, is the student population of Boston Public Schools has decreased.
Absolutely.
And that's frustrating, because the population of the city has increased pretty substantially. And I know there are factors, and you've got non-BPS schools and opportunities for kids, but I think that really speaks to the heart of one of the issues that we want to discuss, which is a lost confidence for many families on BPS. And it's something that I know we reject, but we all, as elected, as appointed officials, have to do a better job making sure that we're working hard and we're working smartly as it relates to our precious education funds. So I just put that asterisk that we can't in good conscience say that we're being more efficient by transporting fewer kids and therefore ostensibly saving money, because we're not. We're actually still spending more money, and as Councillor Sabi George noted, this half of 1%, or less than half of 1% increase over fiscal 19 isn't going to stay. It's going to be more than that. But we're also seeing fewer and fewer families choosing BPS, and it's just something that will really drive, I think, a lot of our work and the council's work going forward as it relates to BPS. On page 3, when you talk about some of the critical cost drivers, you note 362 trips have 4 or fewer students. And are those students still on the buses themselves? I guess my point is,
They're riding, yes. Yes.
can we look at vans? Can we look at cars, just to both the environmental impact, the cost impact, the traffic impact? I mean, I could go on and on and on, but I'm sure do we offer any smaller vehicles for transportation for some of these smaller needed trips?
Yeah, so the BPS fleet right now is 721 buses total. 154 or 155 of those are on MS vans, so they're mini safety. So the full bus, your typical yellow school bus, has a capacity of 71 students, and those MSs have 12. So from a cost perspective, they cost about the same. The big bus might be a little bit more expensive, but what the real cost is here, as you can see if you looked at the slide with TransDev costs. So,
While Ed is looking for that, Councilor OMalley, I think one thing that's really important, and you raised the right point, and Councilor George raises the same point. Superintendent Cassellius is really committed to operational integrity. One of the reasons that we have contracted with a national expert who's been on site for about 5 months to do a really deep dive is to look at opportunities for efficiencies, for cost savings, and for on-time performance improvements. I will tell you that the focus of his work for the first phase of what we hope to implement, what we hope to share with you, and what we hope to implement really is going to be focused on on-time performance, right? So what we do know is that we cannot cut our way to improvements. So we first have to focus on getting kids safely to school on time, starting from day one. We're going to be prepared, we believe, to make significant improvements in that. At the same time, doing that means taking a look at our cost drivers. And some of those cost drivers I think we can control. So whether we have alternative means of transportation, whether it is ride shares, whether it is vans, whether there are alternate modes of transportation. But then it's also looking at the levers, as you raised. What are our levers in looking at policies, whether it's transportation of students going to charter schools. We've been deferring to scheduling concerns to non-BPS students rather than looking at scheduling concerns from the BPS perspective first. So I think that you're raising good questions that we hope to be able to share with you, both initial findings as well as the recommendations for phase 1 implementation. We hope to do that within the next, hopefully, several weeks. Mike Terza has been on site for about not quite 5 months, and so he's getting to the point where he's got some recommendations for us for the beginning of the school year, and those will be part of those recommendations. I didn't mean to step on Ed while he was looking for data, but wanted to assure you that we have a commitment to doing better. And I think to your point, if we don't name it, we can't fix it.
That's right.
So we want to be really transparent about what those findings will be.
Sure. No, I appreciate that.
Absolutely.
Did you have
yeah, the only thing I wanted to mention just from the cost efficiency of a smaller vehicle is the cost is in the body. So, we would be spending the same on salary of a person driving a big bus versus, a small van.
Well, I'd respectfully push back on that. I think if we have opportunities, we've got 3 or 4 kids going to a school, a smaller, a sedan, and heck, I'd like to see an electric fleet of vehicles of our municipal businesses, our municipal departments such as BPS. Is that something that we could not explore? Could we do that? Why not, and why haven't we? If we have so many trips, several hundred trips, 300 and however many, I lost my notes here, but 300 plus trips per day that are few students or fewer, 362 trips, 4 students or fewer, why wouldn't we look at having sedans for that? Which, yes, the cost of the bus driver, and we want to make sure that we have a safe, qualified, professional bus driver or vehicle driver working there, but the environmental impact is significantly less. The wear and tear on the roads is significantly less. The efficiency of a vehicle is significantly less. So can we do that?
I think that nothing is off the table, right?
Okay.
I think that nothing is off the table, including there are other districts that will look at opportunities for parents. So you give some sort of a subsidy to a parent to do transportation. So there are multiple creative solutions that we can consider. I think the larger question is going to be how we engage with the community to really engage in those. Safety is first, on-time
Yep.
performance is second.
No question
right?
about that.
And then we get to cost drivers.
Well, I appreciate that everything's on the table. I'm hopeful that we're even more on the table, and when we talk about this year's budget, we're actually going to see this way that we could save money and provide a
Yes.
better service to our students. And to that end, I know you talk, I think it's page 5, you talk about non-BPS students accounting for 21% of total spending. Private sped is $6 million in total, which is approximately $300K per pupil spending, which obviously is the highest. I assume this is out-of-district private schools primarily.
Correct.
And what number of students make up that? Do you know offhand? I guess the right number of students right here, I've got it. So it's 202.
Yep.
And how many schools is that? Well, you look for that. I'll sort of. I think you can see where I'm getting at, because this is a factor that we talk about when we talk about special ed as well, and the incredible cost for out-of-district placement. And this is now my 5th superintendent. I will always give enormous credit to Dr. Johnson, Carol Johnson, who really made it a focus to limit the number of out-of-district placements that we allow for. And I understand there are certain things that we can't satisfy or we can't address efficiently. That number should get to 0, but we are seeing that number grow. And while it's a relatively small number of students, the cost is significant. And I wonder, again, to my earlier point, I'm assuming that's 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 students to some of these schools, these specialized schools. Do we look at changing the way we transport those kids to make sure it's safe and make sure that it's more efficient?
I think we do, right? And I don't think that we have these conversations, to your point, about limiting out-of-district placements, right? I think that this all plays together. So while it's really important to start to take a deep dive and a deep look at transportation and those cost drivers, we also would be remiss to not acknowledge that this talks about assignment, this talks about placement, this talks about the choices that parents are making outside of BPS. It speaks to the lack of confidence, right? So I think that there are multiple conversations that play into this. But yes, the conversation about limiting out-of-district placements is something that we are having. We also have a firm belief in parental choice. Boston is a community that has made a commitment to multiple choices for parents. So we want to find the sweet spot, if you will, between not dampening the opportunity for parents to choose while also creating the value proposition.
There's no question, but just to be clear, there's a difference between BPS versus charter versus parochial
Absolutely.
in Boston, and out-of-district placement, which we send as a last resort when a parent feels that his or her child cannot have their needs met, and that's something that we should all strive to get to 0. We should be able to offer services for every kid in Boston.
Absolutely.
So.
Our goal is that every parent will choose BPS.
Agreed.
Within just a very short time.
Agreed. And then my last question, I've asked this in years past, and maybe you've addressed it, maybe I missed it in today's presentation, but walk me through the process where a student gets door-to-door services, and then he or she may have some IEP or some special accommodations to necessitate that, but as they progress through their elementary school career, a corner-to-corner service would be better for them, both socially, both sort of to allow them to work on their independence. How can a parent basically downgrade, for lack of a better word, for door-to-door to corner-to-corner service?
They call a team meeting, and they'll acknowledge that in a team meeting, and if the parent feels and the staff and the team feel that the student is able to do that, then they'll take that part out of the IEP and we'll transition them to a door-to-door.
And do we encourage that for our families? Because I would think that, just knowing, anecdotally and firsthand with some friends, students that because of a great education at BPS, who've had some difficulties, either social or emotional or otherwise, are then able to sort of change how they're picked up, go down to the corner, meet with friends, have that 5-10 minutes in the morning that's great for their socialization and sort of their own, school life. So can we see some data that shows the number of door-to-doors that then transition to corner, and in ways that perhaps we should be encouraging that where appropriate?
Sure, we can. And I know over the years we've did a big push on reaching out to families and asking them if they want expedited option, how to connect them with the
That's
process
great.
and how to do that. So
No, I appreciate
we'll
that,
continue
too.
to move on some of that.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you all. This is obviously something that I know all of us to a person have very strong feelings about. It's frustrating that we can't just wave a magic wand, and I do really appreciate the great work that all of you do and the folks sitting behind me and those that are at the bowling building. I know this is difficult work, but incredibly important work and one that we all feel very strongly about. So thank you all. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councilor.
Thank you. Councillor Breeden?
I'm really here to listen and learn. I have a background of working in special ed for 16 more years. What would be an out-of-district placement where I worked. So I'm very cognizant of the importance of transportation and safe transportation and how concerning it is for parents that their kids are safe on the journey to school. But I'm learning a lot here. Thank you very much.
I have a few questions. One is just how the sort of work that you said that Mike is doing around, really scrutinizing this, like how that is going to interact with our budget process. Because obviously you have a draft school budget that's currently sitting before the school committee, and we would expect it to come to us in April. And I'm just sort of curious what the likelihood of those two processes meeting this year is, or kind of what we should expect on that front.
I think the likelihood of intersection is really high. I think that you will see in the budget proposal that we made, and Ed can speak to more detail on that, there were some recommendations for technology for transportation systems to improve the onboard sort of navigation and tools that are being used by our current staff of bus drivers. I think that it is also likely that what our initial sort of indications from Mike are that there shouldn't be a lot of additional cost with the first wave of recommendations. And so I think if anything, you will see a focus on on-time performance, and hopefully that performance will translate into some additional bending of the curve. I think longer-term recommendations may be likely to have some budget implications, but it is also I think it's premature, right? We haven't seen the full scope of those recommendations, but in terms of this year's budget process, I don't think there would be a long or a large, I don't see an additional ask beyond what we've seen in the BPS budget that's been introduced so far. But the intersection of those recommendations and the budget process that's likely. I think that we're going to see some recommendations from Mike within the next, month.
Yeah. And to Dell's credit, who's not here, again, she's been doing a great job with her team to identify what she needs for support and resources, and all that's reflected in the current budget as it's written.
Yeah.
But Mike's recommendations are chiefly focused on achieving better on-time performance.
Correct.
Not on bending the curve around transportation costs.
His charge was on-time performance, so that was the initial charge that he was brought in. I can't imagine that we wouldn't want to continue to look at costs, but his charge when he was brought in was based on the community feedback the superintendent got, the opening of the school, what the school committee had communicated to her about improving on-time performance.
And can you speak to sort of how our transportation costs on kind of a per student basis and overall kind of compare to other districts?
I don't have too much detail. What I do know off the top of my head is I think Buffalo is the only district that spends more on a per pupil basis, and they have full school choice in Buffalo. So as we've seen, a lot of themes here come down to school choice and the placement of programs. So the only school district that is spending more is the one with even more school choice than ours.
But are we the school district with the second highest school choice in I guess my question would be, is there anybody out there who is providing a variety of school choice similar to ours and is managing to get transportation?
That I'd have to follow up with.
Yeah.
I think anecdotally, and I don't have the details, but Mike Terza came to us from Milwaukee, which had a very high degree of school choice. It was a larger district, transporting at least a third more students than we are. And I think that their cost per pupil was substantially less, but it was not the lowest. I think that the degree of choice, the unique attributes of a community, if you're dealing with weather and you're dealing with things like that, will always drive costs.
Right, but it seems like therefore all the more important for us to find like comparable benchmarks, because this is a big enough portion of our budget that doing even a bit better on it
Yep.
would give us a lot more money for other things. I guess those are my chief questions. Did you say? Can you just repeat again? Right now on the bus monitor side, we're over the line item. Sort of.
Oh,
We're
yes.
is it 10.6 instead of 8.9?
Correct.
Okay, and that's projected for the year. So it's not that we're already.
Oh, yeah, no,
That
that's
much
on the
ahead.
annualized. The
That's sort of-
10.6 is what we're projecting for the annual. It's not year-to-date spending.
And so that means we've encountered, needing more bus monitors than we had anticipated. Have we been able to effectively hire? Like, I guess there's two problems there. One is that we didn't project it correctly, and the other is, when you actually have a student who's been assigned a monitor, are we able to get one for them? Or
Yes, I think we've been pretty successful. Last year, on average, there was, I think, 490 to 500 monitors working every week. And obviously, there is some, turnover in that. And we're trending, I think, 540 to 550, but I can get you the exact figure. So we've really pushed the hiring, right before school started and continued through today to make sure that we have enough monitors and providing, a monitor wherever they're needed.
Councilor Savage?
Thank you. I do have a couple more questions. Earlier this afternoon, we had a meeting around the Boston Compact model, and we had a conversation with Rob Consalvo about the challenges with the three different types of schools, Boston Public, parochial, charter schools, and sort of that dynamic that it creates within, and the impact it has on transportation costs. And that we noted in that conversation that there's a group of students who are dually enrolled and then also dually assigned transportation buses. Can we talk a little bit about how we clean that up? Because I think we can realize some smaller cost savings across the district when we clean some of these challenges up.
So historically, I've only been with the department about 2 years now, but historically, when students were dual enrolled, they were assigned 2 buses. So if I was assigned to a charter school and a BPS school, in the system, we would have sent a bus to both schools and, to service both stops. This year, to get technical, there was 2 different databases covering non-BPS students and BPS students. This year, they turned off the non-BPS database and merged it with the BPS one, so we literally couldn't do that anymore. So it's something we're looking to work through in terms of planning, because the faster we can, unenroll a student from one place, the quicker we can schedule and send that bus.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add to that is just our sensitivity to families' choice again here, because sometimes families hedge their bet around kind of where they attend school and make a final decision on. So although we want to make sure we provide one bus and one service, we also have to make sure we receive the information from the families to say, I want to go to this school or that school, and make sure we can then opt out of the transportation so that we're not leaving them stranded as well.
How quickly do we do that?
It varies depending on the case of families. Some are really good at, once they know that they're going to, say they accepted to a BPS school that they wanted to go to, then they'll commit to going to the school. And then if they are waiting to go to charter school, on the flip side of that coin, they hedge their bets because that takes a little longer. But our BPS process internally is that we have 8 days where a student doesn't return to school, where we have it's called the did not report window. And in that window is where we closely monitor, who's coming, who's not, and then we're moving and shifting things around. So it's also in those first 8 days.
During the first 8 days of school?
Right.
And are we asking charter and parochial schools to share that information with us?
Over the years, we've been doing a significantly better job in working with the compact and working through a lot of these logistical issues. So I think as long as those conversations keep happening, I think we'll be in a better position.
Yeah.
And then I know all of our students, the majority of our students, 7 through 12, receive an M7 pass. I recently met with the Boston Student Advisory Council, and they have some concerns around the policy when the M7 card is lost or stolen, and how different schools have different policies around getting a kid a new card. So I'm curious about any conversations about that, but then also the costs associated. When a card is reported lost, is it shut off? What do we, is the state charging us for it? Tell me about that.
When we went to M7 for All in this current fiscal year, this budget, we transitioned, I guess, from paying a per pass rate to negotiating a flat rate. So that contract for year 1 and 2 is $6.7 million, and then it goes up a little bit for year 3. It's the contract between us and the MBTA. So that's what they're charging us for all the M7 passes that we require for all the 7th and 12th graders. So it's almost it doesn't matter if it's 3,000 or 30,000 M7s or 30,001 M7s, right under the current model. Historically, it was on a per pass basis.
And then what about the policy around replacing lost cards?
So we're trying to wrap our hands around the actual problem and what that really looks like, because we do have students who go through, certain passes amount a year. So we haven't quite quantified that, and that's some of the analysis that we'll be working on as well. And BSAC has made it totally clear that this is an issue, and this is definitely something we're paying attention to.
I would also say that they are actually, they've provided us some creative solutions around incentives and positive peer pressure for hanging on to your pass. So we're engaging with them as well in this conversation.
Love it. And shifting gears, Councilor OMalley talked a little bit about electrifying a portion of the fleet or whatever. The 721 buses, do we own them or does TransDev own? We own them.
Schools own them.
And so what's our how often are we cycling through buses, replenishing the fleet? And have there been conversations around electrifying the fleet? And what cost benefit would that have to the district over the short and long term?
So most school buses, proper life cycle is about 10 years, is how long they should be on the road. Obviously, there are pluses and minuses depending on the smaller bus versus a wheelchair bus, which has specific mechanics and technical specs. So because we have about 700, we're doing about 70 buses per year to keep up, to make sure that we're around/under that 10-year average life of a bus.
And then our greening initiatives.
Yeah, this year is the first year where actually over half of our fleet is running on propane versus diesel. Propane is a clean source of energy. I know a lot of school districts have been pushing and transitioning towards electric. When you hear about that, they're actually only buying 1 or 2 buses because it's very, very expensive. So the only way that any district that I know of that has purchased a bus is with grant funding because they are 3-4 times as expensive as a propane and or diesel bus. So.
But are they realizing savings over the long term? Have we looked? Is there anyone looking at that?
I don't think we've looked at it to that detail, but I know with the propane use of buses, we've thoroughly researched that, and that's kind of the direction we're headed in. We've been heading it over the years, and we found significant gains in that.
Yeah, the propane buses have been great for the students and the bus monitors and drivers as well. I mean, I remember talking to a driver who said the propane buses are super quiet, where they would leave the diesel buses and it's like a rattling in their ears, but with this, it's a much better work environment for them. And then nationwide, diesel buses are a major contributor for students and asthma. So this has been, pretty profound in that as well.
So please, when you're noticing arrival at a school, just notice how quiet it is or dismissal.
I'm going to pay
of the
attention
buses.
to that now. Yeah.
Look for the, all our buses now are Bluebird. That's the company, and there's a blue, most of them have a blue bird on top. The ones that have a green bird are propane buses.
My last question is around the safe routes to schools. I think we're, just a couple of weeks ago, it was Walk to School Day, and lots of schools, whether kids walked or transported or took the bus to school, still had some sort of walking event. Are we looking to expand that at all? Or one of the challenges I think that lots of families would, especially if they lived in closer proximity to school, would let kids walk if they felt it was a safe option. Can you talk a little bit about the future of that program?
So this current year, the city was awarded, I think, $1 million grant. BPDA and Public Works and BTD really took the reins on that, because Public Works had to actually do the work of putting up lighting and fixing sidewalks and street signs and whatnot. So that's where a lot of the funding goes. I believe they just opened another round for additional funding, but I haven't seen details on it yet. But I know we're working on, we're assisting Public Works and everyone else on that $1 million grant to decide which sidewalks and which directions.
Yeah,
students
you're
are
familiar
going.
with Jill Carter, who's our executive director of Health and Wellness. She's championed a lot of this work, and we're working real closely out of her office in schools to kind of make sure we have as many opportunities as possible for families and students to walk to school, be healthy and safe in the neighborhoods as well. So.
And I would just tell you anecdotally, Superintendent Caselius is a huge champion of Safe Routes to School. She's done a lot of work in it in previous roles. I would also say that everything relates back to transportation, but our minimum quality guarantee or our high quality guarantee for all of our schools and really creating a high quality system of schools in every neighborhood hopefully is going to be contributing to more students being able to choose closer to home.
I think.
I somehow just get drawn back to this chamber, and I can't pass up the opportunity to add to the discussion, only because we're doing a lot of work as part of the MassCast 2.0 and the efforts around MassCast and the task force. And as you know, we have schools that are immediately impacted in those areas, particularly Orchard Gardens. Part of the MassCast 2.0 calls for a Safe Routes to School initiative that we're going to pilot, and so we're working very closely with Jen Tracy and Chief Martinez in Health and Human Services as part of the MassCast 2.0 to pilot a Safe Routes to School initiative specifically around the MassCast efforts that will enhance and complement the work being done by BTD and Jill Carter's team as well. So they'll be separate but similar, and each unique given what's happening around Orchard Gardens.
I think that also could impact some of the concerns around door-to-door versus corner-to-school, because as families feel that the corner may be unsafe for their child, they're going to advocate more heavily for door-to-door, where the least restrictive and most appropriate is likely the corner, if not walking to school. So it's all of these sort of pieces that feed into its policy decisions and other things that we do that create, that impact the transportation budget. And I think it's important to note, and I appreciate, Charlene, you in particular, I think with your exchange with Councilor OMalley, talk about sort of the safety, the on-time performance, and then controlling the costs.
Yes.
And I think that that's spot on. But when we can control the costs, we can reinvest in, I think what Councilor Bach referred to is just other things that our kids need in our schools and more student-facing support. So for me, this effort's really about reining in costs, considering the safety and on-time performance, but reining in those costs, because those are dollars that we don't have to take from other efforts in our schools, and I think greatly benefit our kids.
If I can just, come in with just a few more questions. I just wanted to check that I understand. Is it possible for a family to have in the IEP for a student that they get door-to-door service but not a one-to-one monitor? Or, yes. And so what's the proportion of, so if we've got 5,500 door-to-door kids, what's the proportion that have sort of one-to-one monitors?
I'd have to check, because there might even be some, I would imagine it's very limited, but there might be even a corner student who has an IEP but doesn't require door-to-door who could have a monitor. So it's not perfectly in line.
Those two
And that's a fluid number, because depending on families' mobilities and comfort levels, it's
And
very fluid.
IEPs continue to change, right?
Right. I guess what I'm trying to understand is if we go to the concluding bar chart that I gave us about kind of, the different segments of student riders and the kind of cost implications, I guess it would be helpful to understand when you've got that 11% going to 35%, what portion of that has to do with monitor personnel costs versus what portion of that has to do with the added complexity of door-to-door routes, because those strike me as sort of two different problems.
Yeah.
And maybe one that we might have some levers with more than the other.
Yeah.
To which I would wonder if you could talk just a little bit about what the district's sort of quality of software for these things, or like how, like in terms of drawing efficient routes and figuring out how to get the maximum number of kids on, and then how to handle changes during the school year and sort of students that transfer schools, or like how do you feel about your current software that you rely on that front?
I think we're evaluating that.
Yeah.
I think Mike Terza has taken a really deep look. He's also looking at national standards and what you want with routing software and comparing that to what we actually have available, and then I would imagine that there will be some recommendations attached to that.
And is that something that we're in a long-term contract around or not?
We use current routing software through the software that was developed by MIT, and we're not in a contract with them.
Okay, got it. I guess, and I mean, I would wonder sort of whether now that we've all got all this like traffic feedback loop data in the rest of our lives, whether BPS is benefiting from that, from the sort of Waze phenomenon or not.
Yeah, so we actually, every single one of our buses is equipped with GPS units. So we actually take not even just Waze data, which is a little different because that's usually vehicles and private vehicles. We take our own bus speeds and pump them back in. So we're trying to get the most accurate map speeds for our schedule.
And we always want to work real closely with our bus drivers, our unions, to kind of review all that information to make sure we're calibrating and triangulating the data as well.
One of the things that is a challenge with using something like Waze is that it doesn't account for the size of a bus on the very narrow streets that we have to drive on. So we also have to balance bus-specific technology with the newest improvements that are coming.
And what is the lag time for a student who transfers schools mid-year in terms of transportation getting rerouted?
That I'm not sure.
I think that it is.
I think it's about 4 or 5 days turnaround time. Yeah.
One of our targets is to improve that turnaround time because it depends on when that change happens, right?
Yeah.
And when things are loaded into a system.
Yeah.
And so I think that our goal would be 3 days. I think we have some room to improve there.
Yeah,
And just from a FAPE standpoint, right?
yeah,
Just making
no,
sure.
recently had a constituent make that kind of transition, and I think just the challenge of if you're a parent with places to be, like,
Yep.
During the day, that to
Exactly.
deal with the sort of sudden
Yes.
gap of coverage is tough. But also, am I right? I think I asked this, but just that despite the increase in the line item, we're not experiencing a shortage of bus monitors? Like, we're managing to get them for all the...
I believe so. We'd have to
Okay.
check on.
I would love
Yeah,
if
I
you
don't know.
would check just to...
I don't have that data.
We will get that data for you. What we do experience, because it is a low rate of pay and it doesn't always come with benefits, because sometimes it is a part-time or it's dependent upon routes, and so we do have a high degree of turnover among monitors. So while we may start with an adequate complement, we experience a lot of turnover with that particular part of our workforce.
Obviously, ultimately, we would need to be adequately providing it. We'd have to be either funding the positions at a sufficient level that people stay with them, or having enough of a pipeline
That's a
to
conversation.
run through. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, I guess the thing, and I think we'll have opportunities to continue this conversation, and really looking forward to what Mike's coming forward with. I just think that it's such an anomalous cost driver for our district as compared to others. And I think that in Boston, we all know that we're unique and special. And so sometimes we can be tempted to say, oh, well, this is Boston. This is just how it has to be here, unlike everywhere else. And I guess that's part of why I asked some of the questions I did, because it seems to me, understanding, are there districts comparable to us and they deal with the door-to-door thing differently, right? And that might be like a big driver, right? Or is there, I think someone alluded to the possibility of, are there other sort of smaller ride-sharing options that we could experiment with? I mean, I would urge you all to be looking at what comparable districts, who is, starting with the question of who's most comparable to us and what could we learn from them, instead of starting from, oh, no one's comparable to us, and so this is sort of the transportation budget that we have to live with, because I just think it really does. I mean, to land back on that point and agree with Councilor Asabi-George, it really does threaten to crowd out other things. Well, it crowds out other things as it stands.
I think one of the best things with Mike Terza coming is when he was with Milwaukee, he was part of Council of Great City Schools, so it's been actually really great because he just taps his network, and in like a day turnaround, we get an email from a similar sized district on what they're doing, so that's a big help.
Yeah.
I'll just add 2 other points. For me, this is certainly about the safety and the on-time performance, but it's also about better budget planning for the next cycle, because we're always seeing these overruns. And then just to the conversation around shortening the amount of time if a student moves, making that as narrow a window as possible, but especially prioritizing our students experiencing homelessness, because as they move from shelter to shelter, which does happen frequently, 3 days is even too much. And we've gotten better at shrinking that window, but a child who's living in a homeless shelter needs to be in school every single day, because that we know is the most consistent, least chaotic place for them likely, and we want to make sure that they're in school every day. So I don't know how we prioritize that child.
We completely agree with you. What we're also, one of the big focuses and one of the big one of the big benefits of improved on-time performance are more hours in school, right? The tremendous loss of educational and instructional time that students are experiencing is because of delays in our busing. So we are completely on the same page and committed to making sure that kids are in school and that they get there safely and on time.
Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. I'll call it this time for public testimony if there's anyone here to testify. Seeing none, I'll remind viewers again that you can email written testimony to ccc.wm@boston.gov. And with that, we'll conclude this hearing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.